In a storm that could bury a man alive, one hardened cowboy rode straight into the unknown, not knowing that behind a broken cabin door lay a secret that would change his life forever. A child abandoned, a past soaked in blood, and a promise that would ignite a war against the most dangerous man in the territory. This is not just a story of survival. It's a story of vengeance, redemption, and a heart that refused to stay cold.
The rain didn't just fall, it drove itself into the earth like iron nails. It was the kind of storm that chased sensible men indoors and sent the wildlife burrowing deep into the mud. But I had never been a sensible man. I sat low in the saddle, my Stetson pulled down against the blinding sheets of water, the heavy canvas of my slicker doing little to stop the damp chill from seeping into my bones. I'm Vance Sterling. Most folks around these parts just know me as the scarred, ill-tempered bastard who runs the sprawling cattle outfit bordering the ridge. They see the Winchester in my scabbard and the cold way I look at strangers, and they keep their distance. That suits me fine. What they don't know, what nobody in this godforsaken territory knows, is that my name is on a bank vault in Nevada holding enough silver to buy this entire county twice over. I'm a millionaire playing in the dirt because the dirt is honest, and the high society I inherited is nothing but a graveyard of vipers in silk suits. Before the silver, I was a U.S. Marshal, and while a man can walk away from a badge, he can never quiet the instincts that kept him alive long enough to retire. Those instincts were screaming right now. I pulled back on the reins, bringing my gelding to a halt. Through the gray curtain of rain, the old Hayes place loomed like a rotting carcass. It was a one-room timber cabin sitting right on the edge of my property line. John Hayes, a decent enough railway surveyor, had built it a year ago for his wife. Then, 2 months back, he vanished. The law called it a drifting man's desertion. My gut called it murder. The cabin had been empty ever since, so why the hell was the front gate swinging open, the rusted latch freshly snapped? I slid off my horse, my boots sinking ankle-deep into the freezing mud. I didn't bother tying the reins. My mount was trained to stand ground. I reached under my slicker and drew my Colt .45. The weight of the gun in my palm was a familiar comfort. The storm was howling, masking any noise from inside, but the hairs on the back of my neck were standing at attention. Someone was in there. I moved with a quiet, lethal grace that my large frame belied, keeping low as I approached the porch. The floorboards groaned slightly under my weight. I pressed my back against the rough, wet wood beside the doorframe. I listened. Nothing but the drumming rain. I didn't wait to knock. I raised my boot and kicked the door right at the lock. The rotted wood splintered with a sharp crack, the door flying open and banging against the interior wall. I swept into the room, sweeping the Colt left, then right, finger hovering over the trigger, ready to put a hole through whoever had trespassed on my territory. The room was dark, smelling of mildew and old dust, empty. I lowered the gun slightly, my eyes adjusting to the gloom. The hearth was cold. The modest furniture was overturned, the mattress slashed open, feathers scattered across the floor like dirty snow. Someone had tossed this place, tearing it apart, looking for something. Then I heard it. A sound so faint it was almost swallowed by the thunder. A ragged, shallow gasp. My grip on the Colt tightened. I moved slowly toward the far corner, my boots silent on the scattered feathers. The sound came from beneath the shattered frame of the bed. I crouched down, keeping my weapon steady, and peered into the shadows. My breath hitched in my chest. It wasn't a bushwhacker. It wasn't a thief. It was a child. A little girl, no older than 7, was shoved as far back into the corner as physics would allow. Her knees were drawn tight to her chest, her bare, mud-caked feet blue from the cold. She was wearing a torn, filthy gingham dress that hung off her emaciated frame. Her dark hair was a matted tangle, but it was her eyes that stopped my heart dead in its tracks. They were enormous, hollow, and filled with a terror so absolute it made my own violent past look like a Sunday school picnic. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just stared at the barrel of my gun, waiting for the end. She was holding a worn leather satchel pressed against her chest, her thin, bruised fingers gripping the straps with white-knuckled desperation. Something inside the hardened, scarred shell of my chest cracked clean down the middle. "Jesus," I breathed out. I holstered the Colt immediately, making sure she saw my hands were empty. I stayed crouched, making myself as small and non-threatening as a man my size could. "Hey there," I said, pitching my voice low and soft, a tone I hadn't used in a decade. "I'm not going to hurt you. Put the gun away, see?" She didn't blink. The shivering racked her tiny body so violently I could hear her teeth chattering. She had been here for days, alone, starving, waiting in the dark. "My name is Vance," I said, moving an inch closer. She flinched, pressing harder into the wall. I stopped. Okay. I'll stay right here. But you're freezing to death under there, little bird. I need to get you warm." She just stared. She was completely mute with trauma. I took off my heavy, dry leather jacket from under my slicker. I tossed it gently so it landed near her feet. She looked at it, then back at me. Slowly, with the agonizing hesitation of a whipped stray, she reached out one trembling hand and pulled the coat over her shoulders. It swallowed her whole. "That's a good girl," I murmured. "I'm going to reach under there and pull you out now. I've got a warm fire and a hot meal waiting up the ridge. You're safe now." I extended my hands. She didn't fight me. When I pulled her into my arms, she felt lighter than a sack of grain. Her skin was ice cold. As I stood up, cradling her against my chest, she buried her face into the crook of my neck, her small fists still holding a death grip on that leather satchel. I held her tight, feeling the frail, rapid beating of her heart against my ribs. In all my years as a marshal, I had seen the worst of what men could do to each other. I had killed men for less than a bad hand at poker. But standing in that ruined cabin, holding a child the world had tried to throw away, a new kind of darkness settled over me. It wasn't the darkness of the storm. It was the cold, calculating darkness of a man making a blood oath. Whoever killed John Hayes, whoever left this little girl to starve in the dark, whoever she was running from. I didn't care how many of them there were. I didn't care what it cost. I walked out of that cabin, stepped into the driving rain, and looked out over the ridge. "I am going to find you," I promised the storm, "and I'm going to send you straight to hell." The ride back to the Sterling Ranch was a blur of driving rain and bone-deep cold. I kept my slicker wrapped tight around the little girl, shielding her from the worst of the squall. She didn't make a sound the entire 2 miles, just kept her face buried in the crook of my neck, her small hands twisted into the fabric of my shirt like I was the only solid thing left in a world that had suddenly turned to liquid mud. By the time the sprawling silhouette of my ranch house materialized through the downpour, my gelding was blowing hard. The Sterling outfit was built like a fortress, solid oak, fieldstone, and thick glass, nestled against the spine of the ridge. I hadn't built it to be welcoming. I'd built it to endure. I nudged the front door open with my boot and carried her straight into the main room. The hearth was a cavernous thing of river rock, and I immediately set about building a roaring fire one-handed, refusing to put her down until the chill was banished from the air. "Grit!" I bellowed down the hall, the raw timber echoing my voice. "Get in here!" A moment later, the heavy thud of boots announced the arrival of Grit Henderson. Grit was a man carved from old leather and bad habits. He'd been my deputy down in the territories a lifetime ago, a tracker who could follow a ghost across bare rock. When I'd inherited the Nevada silver and bought this spread to hide from the world, Grit was the only piece of my old life I allowed to follow me. He stopped dead in the archway, his hand habitually resting on the butt of his revolver, his gray eyes snapping from me to the bundle in my arms. "Well, I'll be damned," Grit muttered, pulling a damp cigarillo from his teeth. "You went out checking fence lines and came back with a stray. Fetch some hot water, Grit, lots of it. And tell Cookie to heat up whatever stew he's got simmering. Now." Grit didn't ask questions. He nodded once and disappeared toward the kitchens. I knelt by the fire, letting the heat wash over us. Carefully, I peeled the oversized, soaked leather jacket off the girl's shoulders. She shivered violently, her huge dark eyes darting around the massive, shadow-filled room. I grabbed a heavy woolen blanket from the back of the sofa and wrapped her in it, creating a cocoon. "You're safe," I told her, my voice dropping back to that low, unfamiliar register. "Nobody gets through that door without my say-so." When the food arrived, I sat on the edge of the stone hearth and fed her myself. It was a clumsy, awkward thing. My hands were calloused, scarred from knife fights and rope burns, built for pulling triggers and breaking mustangs, not wielding a tin spoon. But I took my time. She ate with a frantic, desperate hunger that made my jaw clench. When she choked on a piece of potato, I gently rubbed her back until she caught her breath, my massive hand covering nearly her entire spine. Still, she held on to that battered leather satchel. Even wrapped in the blanket, her thin arms clamped it to her chest. By nightfall, the storm broke, leaving behind a heavy, humid stillness. I had set the girl up on the plush leather sofa near the fire, and exhaustion had finally claimed her. I stood by the window, a glass of amber whiskey in my hand, watching the moon cut through the breaking clouds. The door behind me creaked. Grit stepped in, smelling of wet wool and chewing tobacco. His face was grim, the deep lines around his mouth carved sharper by the firelight. "I went back out to the Hayes place," Grit said softly, taking a seat at the heavy oak table. "Followed the tracks before the rain washed them completely out." I turned, my blood running a degree colder. "And?" "5 riders. Heavy horses shod with those custom iron flats they use over at the logging camps. They circled the cabin, tore the place apart, then headed north." Grit paused, spitting into a brass spittoon. "Silas Thorne's men, Vance. No doubt about it." I gripped the whiskey glass until my knuckles turned white. Silas Thorne. The name was a curse word in this valley. He was a timber baron and a railroad speculator, a man who believed the law was something you bought and paid for in gold coin. He employed a small army of mercenaries to run off homesteaders, break up strikes, and secure his monopolies. He was exactly the kind of rot I had come here to escape. "John Hayes was surveying the Canyon Pass," I said, the pieces snapping together in my mind with lethal clarity. "It's the only viable grade for the new railroad spur. If Thorne controls that land, he controls the entire territory's freight." "Hayes disappeared 2 months ago," Grit reminded me. "And now Thorne's boys are tossing his house. They're looking for something, Vance, and judging by the way they tore up those floorboards, they didn't find it." My eyes drifted to the sleeping girl by the fire, and the leather satchel clutched against her chest. Before I could speak, the deep, frantic barking of my blue heelers shattered the night. Grit was on his feet instantly, his revolver clearing leather. I set my glass down, the whiskey untouched. I didn't reach for the Colt at my hip. Instead, I walked to the gun cabinet by the door and pulled out the Winchester 1873 rifle. I checked the action, the metallic clack-clack sounding like a gavel dropping in a quiet courtroom. "Stay with her," I ordered Grit. I stepped out onto the wide, covered porch. The night air was thick and cool. At the edge of the yard, just beyond the glow of the porch lanterns, 5 riders had pulled up. Their horses were shifting restlessly, flanks steaming in the damp air. They wore long canvas dusters, and I could see the glint of moonlight on rifle barrels. The man in the center nudged his horse forward. I recognized him. Pike. He was Thorne's right-hand man, a cruel-eyed brute with a scarred jaw and a penchant for inflicting pain. He had an unlit briar pipe clamped between his yellow teeth. "Evening, Sterling," Pike called out, his voice dripping with forced civility. "Nasty night for a ride." I stood at the edge of the porch, the Winchester resting casually across my forearm. "You're trespassing on Sterling land, Pike. You've got exactly 10 seconds to turn those horses around before I start thinning your herd." Pike chuckled, a wet, ugly sound. "No need for hostilities, Vance. We're just out looking for some lost property. A little girl, specifically. Belongs to a associate of Mr. Thorne's." We heard you might have picked her up wandering the ridge. I don't deal in lost property, I said, my voice dead flat. And I don't deal with Silas Thorne's lapdogs. One of the riders behind Pike shifted, his hand moving toward the pistol at his waist. We ain't asking, you scarred freak, mister. Thorne wants the brat, and he wants whatever she's carrying. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I just moved. With a speed that defied my size, I brought the Winchester up to my shoulder. I didn't aim for the man's chest. I aimed higher. Crack! The rifle roared, spitting a tongue of flame into the dark. Pike jerked violently backward in his saddle. The briar pipe he'd been holding between his teeth exploded into a shower of wood splinters and hot ash, inches from his nose. His horse reared, screaming, as the echo of the gunshot rolled across the valley. The other 4 men scrambled, pulling their weapons, but my rifle was already cocked again, aimed dead at the center of Pike's chest. The next one goes through your throat, I said, my voice carrying over the panicked snorting of the horses. You go back and tell Silas Thorne that this ranch is sovereign soil. Tell him that if one of his men steps foot on my grass, if I even see a shadow belonging to him near my fence line, I won't send for the sheriff. I'll come for him myself, and I will burn his empire to the ground with him inside it. Pike was breathing hard, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and sudden vivid terror. He wiped a drop of blood from his lip where a splinter had cut him. He looked at the smoking barrel of my rifle, then at the cold, dead certainty in my eyes. He knew I wasn't a rancher issuing a hollow threat. He was looking at the ghost of a U.S. Marshal who had left a trail of bodies across 3 states. You're making a mistake, Sterling, Pike snarled, pulling his horse's head around. A fatal one. Get off my land, I whispered. They rode out hard, disappearing into the dark, the sound of their hooves fading into the night. I stood there for a long time, the rifle hot in my hands, letting the adrenaline bleed out of my system. When I finally turned back to the house, the door was slightly ajar. Standing in the doorway, the blanket trailing behind her like a royal cape, was the little girl. She had woken up at the gunshot. She had seen the whole thing. I froze, suddenly terrified that the violence had broken whatever fragile trust I had managed to build. I expected her to shrink away, to see me as just another monster in a world full of them. Instead, she stepped out onto the porch. Her bare feet made no sound on the damp wood. She walked right up to me, looking up at my scarred face and the rifle in my hand. Slowly, she reached out. Her tiny, fragile fingers wrapped around my massive, calloused thumb. She gripped it tight. She didn't say a word, but she didn't have to. She was anchoring herself to the storm. I looked down at her, feeling a profound, terrifying shift in the tectonic plates of my life. I knelt, placing a hand gently on her head. I've got you, I vowed to the night sky. I've got you. I've got... The morning sun broke over the ridge like a raw wound, painting the heavy, low-hanging clouds in shades of bruised purple and crimson. Tension hung over the Sterling Ranch thicker than the morning mist. I had my men armed and patrolling the perimeter. Every gate was locked, every approach covered. We were at war, and everyone on the payroll knew it. Inside the house, the atmosphere was entirely different. The little girl, who I still hadn't heard speak a single syllable, was sitting at the heavy oak dining table. Cookie, a grizzled old chuckwagon veteran, had piled her plate high with flapjacks, thick slabs of bacon, and scrambled eggs. She was eating with a steady, determined focus, no longer frantic, just ravenous. I sat at the head of the table, sipping black coffee, watching her. The terror that had clouded her eyes the day before had receded, replaced by a cautious, calculating intelligence. She knew she was safe here. She knew the men outside with rifles were there for her. Grit leaned against the door frame, chewing on a matchstick. "She's a tough little weed, ain't she?" he murmured. "She had to be," I replied quietly. When she finished her plate, she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, a gesture so unrefined and childish it made my chest ache. Then she slid off the chair. She didn't run away. She walked straight over to where she had left her leather satchel by the fireplace, picked it up, and walked back to me. She stood beside my chair, looking up at me. Then she held the bag out. It was an offering, a surrender of her most guarded secret. "You want me to open this?" I asked softly. She nodded once. I took the satchel. The leather was old, cracked, and stained with water and mud. My large fingers felt clumsy as I unbuckled the brass straps. I placed the bag on the table and opened the flap. Inside, wrapped carefully in an oilcloth to protect it from the damp, was a thick sheaf of papers and a small, leather-bound journal. I unrolled the papers first. Grit pushed off the doorframe and came to stand behind my shoulder. "Well, I'll be," Grit whistled low. They were architectural drafts and topography maps, highly detailed, drafted with professional precision. It was the Canyon Pass, the disputed territory Thorne was trying to claim. But these weren't just maps of the land. They were geological surveys indicating deep, unstable fault lines and limestone caverns running directly beneath the proposed railroad grade. More importantly, overlaid on these maps were detailed schematics for controlled demolitions, calculations for dynamite placement, load-bearing stress points, and fuse timings. John Hayes wasn't just surveying a route, I said, my voice tight. He was figuring out how to blow it to hell. "Look here," Grit pointed to a note scribbled in the margin. "The northern face is a facade. One coordinated blast at coordinates 34A will trigger a rock slide massive enough to bury the pass permanently. Thorne cannot build here. It's a death trap." Hayes found out the pass was unstable, I realized. Thorne probably knew, but he didn't care. He just wanted the government contract and the monopoly. If he built the rail line, it would eventually collapse, taking hundreds of lives with it. Hayes must have threatened to expose him. And Hayes drew up the exact plans on how to render the pass completely useless to stop him, Grit finished. No wonder Thorne's boys are tearing the countryside apart looking for this. With these papers, a single man with enough dynamite could destroy millions of dollars of Silas Thorne's investments in an afternoon. I set the maps down. The weight of what the girl had been carrying hit me like an anvil. She was holding the key to destroying the most powerful man in the territory. Then my eyes fell on the leather-bound journal. I picked it up. It felt heavy. The edges of the pages were stiff, stained with a rusty, dark brown substance that my former life recognized instantly. Dried blood. I opened the cover. The handwriting inside was elegant but rushed, frantic. August 12th, the first entry read, "They killed John." I saw them. Silas Thorne's men caught him by the river. They wanted the schematics, but John had already mailed a decoy package to the capital. They shot him and threw him in the rapids. Oh God, my John. I felt the air suck out of the room. I glanced down at the girl. She was watching my face, her dark eyes solemn. "What's your name, little bird?" I asked softly. She hesitated, then opened her mouth. Her voice was raspy from disuse, barely a whisper. "Lily?" "Lily," I repeated. "That's a pretty name. Did your mama write this book?" She nodded, tears suddenly welling in her huge eyes, though they didn't fall. I turned back to the journal, skipping ahead to the last entry, dated just 4 days ago. The handwriting here was jagged, desperate. "They are tracking us. We can't run much further. Lily is so brave, but she's so small and it's so cold. I know what Thorne wants. He wants the maps and he wants no witnesses. I found the old cabin by the ridge. I have hidden Lily beneath the floorboards. I gave her the satchel. I told her to be silent as a mouse no matter what she hears." I swallowed hard, the words blurring slightly. "I am leaving the cabin. I am going to walk out into the open and let them see me. I will draw them away from the house. I will lead them into the deep timber. It is the only way to buy her time. If anyone finds this book, if anyone finds my little girl, please, please protect her. Her name is Lily. Tell her I love her more than life. I am walking into the wolf's den so my bird can fly. Evelyn Hayes." I closed the book. The silence in the dining room was absolute, save for the crackling of the fire. Evelyn Hayes. A widow? a mother who had sacrificed herself running into the dark to lead a pack of killers away from her child. She hadn't just hidden Lily, she had bought her daughter's life with her own body. I had spent my life surrounded by tough men, men who bragged about their gunfights and their grit. But sitting there, holding that blood-stained diary, I knew I was holding the testament of someone braver than any man I had ever met. And she was out there, in Silas Thorne's logging camp, a prisoner, or worse. A cold, terrifying calm settled over me. It was the calm that always came before the violence, the absolute absence of hesitation that had made me a legend with a badge. I stood up. I didn't look at Grit. I didn't have to. Grit? Yeah, boss. You take Lily. You take her down to the storm cellar. You lock the heavy iron door, and you sit on the other side of it with a shotgun. If any man whose face you don't recognize gets within 50 yards of this house, you blow him in half. You're going to Thorne's camp, Grit stated. It wasn't a question. He has Evelyn Hayes. Vance, Thorne's camp is a fortress. He's got 30 hired guns on payroll. You ride in there alone, you're riding into a meat grinder. I turned to look at my old friend. The Nevada silver, the cattle, this massive ranch. It all felt like ash in my mouth. I had tried to escape the violence of the world, but the world had brought its violence to my doorstep and shoved a starving, traumatized child into my arms. I'm not riding in as a rancher, Grit, I said, my voice as hard as flint. I'm riding in as the man who's going to end this. I walked to my study. I unlocked the heavy iron safe hidden behind my desk. I didn't touch the stacks of banknotes or the property deeds. I reached into the back and pulled out the heavy leather gun belt I hadn't worn in 3 years. I strapped it on. I strapped it. The weight of the twin Colt peacemakers settled against my thighs. An old, dark, familiar magic. I loaded the Winchester, shoving brass cartridges into the loading gate until it couldn't hold any more. Then I went to the locked wooden crate in the corner and pulled out 6 sticks of mining dynamite, packing them carefully into a saddlebag alongside a coil of fuse wire. If Silas Thorne wanted a monopoly on destruction, I was going to show him what a real professional could do. As I walked back out into the hall, Lily was standing there. She looked at the gun strapped to my legs, the rifle in my hand, the dark, lethal intent radiating off me. I crouched down one last time, putting myself at her eye level. Lily, I said, looking into those dark, resilient eyes, your mama is a very brave woman. She fought hard to keep you safe. Lily's lower lip trembled. Is she dead? I don't know, I answered honestly, because I wouldn't lie to this child. But I promise you this, I'm going to find her. And if she is breathing, I will bring her back to you. And the men who hurt her, I paused, making sure she understood the absolute certainty in my voice. They are going to regret the day they were born. I stood up, threw my slicker over my shoulders to cover the arsenal I was carrying, and walked out the door. The rain had stopped, but the sky was black and heavy. I mounted my gelding, turned his head toward the deep timber where Silas Thorne's empire lay, and spurred him into a gallop. I was going into the wolf's den. But Thorne was about to find out that he wasn't the biggest predator in these woods. The Blackwood timber tract was a jagged scar cut deep into the territory's oldest forest. Silas Thorne hadn't just built a logging camp. He had built a kingdom of sawdust, iron, and blood. The ride took me 3 hours through treacherous, mud-slicked switchbacks. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky the color of bruised iron and a biting wind that whipped through the towering pines. I didn't try to mask my approach. If you want to walk into a wolf's den without getting torn apart at the threshold, you don't sneak in like a thief. You kick the front door open like you own the slaughterhouse. I crested the final ridge and looked down at the camp. It was massive. Rows of rough-hewn bunkhouses sat behind a palisade of sharpened timber. A steam-powered sawmill churned by the river, vomiting black smoke into the gray sky. Armed guards carrying repeating rifles patrolled the catwalks. Thorn was paying a small army to protect his illegal empire. I spurred my gelding forward, riding straight down the muddy track toward the main gate. "Hold it right there," a voice barked from the guard tower as I approached. Two men stepped out from behind the heavy timber gates, rifles raised and leveled at my chest. "State your business, stranger. This is private property." I didn't stop my horse until the barrel of the closest rifle was 3 feet from my horse's nose. I looked down at the guard, my face a mask of cold, scarred stone. "My name is Vance Sterling," I said, letting the name hang in the damp air. "And I don't talk to errand boys. You go tell Silas Thorne that the man who owns the largest spread south of the ridge is here. Tell him I brought capital and I'm looking to buy." The guard sneered. "Mr. Thorne ain't seeing no dirt-scratching ranchers today." I reached into my saddlebag, my hand brushing past the cold, waxy sticks of dynamite. I bypassed them, grabbing a heavy, unadorned leather pouch. I tossed it down. It hit the mud at the guard's boots with a heavy metallic thud. The tie loosened, and a spill of solid, minted gold double eagles gleamed against the wet earth. The guard's eyes widened, the sneer dropping from his face instantly. "There's $2,000 in that bag," I said, my voice dead flat. "That's just to buy my way through this gate. Now pick it up, wipe off the mud, and fetch your boss, before I decide to take my investments to Chicago." Money talks out west. But gold screams. The guards scrambled, one of them scooping up the pouch like it was holy water. The heavy timber gates groaned open. I rode into the camp, ignoring the stares of the hardened mercenaries and exhausted loggers. I was directed to a large 2-story building in the center of the compound. It was absurdly out of place, painted white, with glass windows and a wide veranda. Thorne's citadel. I dismounted, leaving the Winchester in its scabbard but keeping the twin Colts strapped to my thighs, hidden beneath the drape of my slicker. I walked up the steps and pushed through the heavy oak doors. Silas Thorne's office looked like a gentleman's club in Boston that had been forcefully dropped into the wilderness. Persian rugs covered the rough plank floors. Bookshelves lined the walls, and a crystal decanter of imported bourbon sat on a mahogany desk. Thorne was sitting behind it. He was a handsome man in his late 40s, dressed in a tailored wool suit, his silver hair slicked back perfectly. But his eyes were a pale, dead blue, the eyes of a shark. He looked up as I entered, a patronizing smile touching his thin lips. "Vance Sterling, the hermit of the ridge. I must admit, when my men told me you were at my gates throwing gold into the mud, I was skeptical. Word around the territory is you despise my kind of industry." "I despise poor management, Thorne," I said, taking a step into the room, but refusing the velvet armchair across from his desk. "I hear you've been having some trouble securing the Canyon Pass. Railroad executives don't like delays." Thorne's smile tightened. "I have the situation under control." "Do you?" I scoffed, leaning slightly against a bookshelf, projecting the arrogant boredom of a wealthy capitalist. "Because from where I'm sitting, you're chasing ghosts in the woods while the government contract deadline breathes down your neck. I know about the haze problem, Thorne." His eyes went flat. His hand drifted casually toward the top drawer of his desk. "Is that so?" "I don't care about your surveyor," I lied smoothly. "I care about land. I'm expanding my cattle operation. I want the grazing rights on the north side of the canyon, and I want the water rights to the river. I have a draft from a Nevada bank in my pocket for $50,000. But I won't buy into a war zone. I need to know you actually have the leverage to clear the title, or I'm walking away." Thorne studied me. $50,000 was a staggering sum. It was enough to fund his railroad project for a year. Greed warred with paranoia in his shark eyes, and greed won. "You want proof of my leverage?" Thorne stood up, smoothing his waistcoat. "John Hayes was a fool. He stole company property, but he left behind a widow, a very stubborn, very foolish widow who knows where that property is. Once she breaks, the land is clear. You have a woman held in a logging camp?" I let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "That's your grand strategy? What if she doesn't break? Everyone breaks, Sterling, Thorne said coldly. Come with me. I'll show you my collateral. Every muscle in my body coiled tight like a struck rattlesnake, but I kept my face utterly indifferent as I followed Thorne out of the office and across the muddy yard to a low, windowless root cellar built into the side of a hill. Two heavily armed guards stood at the heavy iron door. Thorne nodded, and one of the guards slid the heavy iron bolt back. The door swung open, revealing a dark, damp set of stone stairs. The smell of mildew, stale air, and copper hit me. She's been down here for 4 days, Thorne said casually, as if discussing livestock. My men have been persuasive, but she's holding on to the location of her daughter and a certain satchel. Not for much longer, though. We descended into the gloom. A single kerosene lantern hung from the low ceiling, casting harsh, flickering shadows. In the center of the damp earth floor, chained by her wrists to a heavy wooden post, was Evelyn Hayes. The breath stalled in my lungs. Her dress, once a pale blue, was torn and stained with dark, dried blood. Her dark hair fell in matted waves over her face. She was slumped forward, her breathing shallow, her wrists raw and bleeding against the heavy iron cuffs. She looked broken, a fragile thing crushed beneath the weight of Thorne's cruelty. But then, hearing our footsteps, she lifted her head. Through the dirt and the bruises marring her beautiful face, her eyes met mine. They were a striking, piercing green, and they weren't broken. They were burning with a fierce, untamed fire. It was the look of a cornered lioness ready to tear the throat out of the next man who touched her. In that single electric second, a current snapped between us. It was as visceral as a physical blow. I had lived a cold, solitary life, but looking into Evelyn Hayes' eyes, the ice in my veins turned to boiling lead. I am going to kill every man in this camp, my mind whispered. Stubborn, Thorne sighed, stepping into the light. Mrs. Hayes, this is Mr. Sterling. He's a businessman. He's here to see if you're a viable asset. Evelyn glared at Thorne, then shifted her gaze to me. She didn't know me. She saw a massive, scarred man in a dark slicker, standing shoulder to shoulder with her tormentor. Go to hell, she rasped, her voice hoarse, her chin lifting in pure defiance. I needed to get close to her. I needed to let her know she wasn't alone before the shooting started. I let out a low, cruel chuckle, playing my part. I stepped past Thorne, walking deliberately into her personal space. I crouched down right in front of her. She didn't flinch. She just stared at me with that magnificent, blazing hatred. I reached out, my large, calloused hand moving toward her face. She jerked her head back, but I caught her jaw. I didn't grip it hard. My fingers were as gentle as I could make them, while still looking rough to the men standing behind me. I leaned in close, so close I could feel the heat radiating off her feverish skin. So close the scent of her, sweat, blood, and something wild and sweet filled my senses. I lowered my head, pretending to inspect the bruising on her cheek. And in a voice so soft that only she could hear. A voice that carried the absolute, unshakable weight of my vow, I whispered, Lily is safe. She's at my ranch. I am here to get you out, Evelyn. When the shooting starts, get down. I felt the violent tremor run through her entire body. Her green eyes widened, the hatred shattering into a shock so profound she stopped breathing. She looked into my eyes, searching the scarred landscape of my face, looking for the lie. She found none. I let go of her jaw, standing up and turning back to Thorne with a dismissive sneer. She looks half dead, Thorne, I lied. If she dies before she talks, your leverage is gone. I'm not buying into a dead end. Thorne's jaw tightened. She won't die. Pike knows how to keep them awake. Right on cue, the heavy iron door at the top of the stairs banged open. Footsteps pounded down the stone steps. Boss, a voice yelled. I recognized the voice immediately. It was Pike, the man I had nearly put a Winchester slug through the night before. Pike came to a halt at the bottom of the stairs, breathing hard. his face bruised and bandaged where the splintered pipe had cut him. He looked at Thorn, then his eyes drifted to me. The color drained from his face. His hand dropped instantly to his holster. "Thorn, get away from him!" Pike screamed. "That's Sterling! He's the bastard harboring the kid! He nearly blew my head off last night!" The charade was over. The fuse was lit. I smiled. It was a terrible, jagged thing. "Time's up," I whispered. The cellar exploded into chaos. Before Pike could clear his revolver from leather, before Thorn could even process the betrayal, my instincts took over. 30 years of surviving gunfights compressed into a fraction of a second. My hands blurred beneath my slicker. I drew both Colt peacemakers in a single fluid motion. The hammers cocked back with a double, simultaneous click that sounded louder than a thunderclap in the confined stone room. I fired my right Colt from the hip. The heavy .45 caliber slug caught Pike dead in the center of his chest. The impact lifted him off his feet, throwing him backward into the two guards standing on the stairs. They went down in a tangle of limbs and cursing. Thorn lunged for me, a silver-plated derringer suddenly appearing in his hand. I didn't shoot him. I needed him alive long enough to regret this. Instead, I pivoted, swinging the heavy steel barrel of my left Colt in a brutal arc. It connected with Thorn's temple with a sickening crunch. His eyes rolled back into his head, and he crumpled to the dirt floor like a puppet with its strings cut. "Evelyn, down!" I roared over the deafening ringing in my ears. The guards on the stairs were untangling themselves, raising their rifles. I didn't wait. I fanned the hammer of my right gun, firing 3 rapid shots up the stairwell. The blinding flashes of muzzle fire illuminated the cellar in staccato bursts. One guard screamed and dropped his rifle, tumbling down the steps. The other retreated, scrambling up into the yard, shouting for reinforcements. The camp alarm bell began to ring, a frantic clanging sound that cut through the approaching dusk. I spun back to Evelyn. She was pressed flat against the earth floor, the chains pulled taut. I holstered my left gun and dropped to my knees beside her. "Hold still," I commanded, pulling a heavy iron key ring from the belt of the unconscious guard at my feet. Evelyn was shaking, but not from fear. The adrenaline was hitting her. She held her bruised wrists out, her green eyes locked on my face. "You really have her? Lily?" "She's safe, eating flapjacks and bossing my ranch hand around," I said, flipping through the keys. My hands steady despite the gunfire echoing in the yard above. I found the smallest key and jammed it into the heavy iron cuff. It clicked, the shackle fell away. I unlocked the second one. Evelyn gasped, pulling her bleeding wrists to her chest. She stumbled as she tried to stand, her legs weak from starvation and confinement. I caught her around the waist, pulling her against my side. Even bruised and broken, she felt incredibly right against me. "Can you walk?" I asked roughly. "I can run," she hissed, her voice laced with pure venom as she looked down at the unconscious Silas Thorn. She reached down and snatched the derringer from Thorn's limp hand, checking the chamber with practiced efficiency. "Lead the way, Mr. Sterling." A fierce grin broke across my scarred face. God, what a woman. "Stay behind me, don't stop moving," I ordered. We took the stairs 2 at a time. I hit the cellar door shoulder first, bursting out into the fading twilight of the camp. It was a hornet's nest. Men were pouring out of the bunkhouses, rifles and revolvers drawn. Someone pointed at me from the catwalk of the sawmill. "There, at the cellar!" Bullets began to snap and hiss through the air around us, thudding into the timber and kicking up geysers of mud. "Cover your ears!" I yelled to Evelyn. I reached into my saddlebag, which I had carried over my shoulder, and pulled out a stick of the mining dynamite. The fuse was short, pre-cut for a 5-second burn. I struck a sulfur match against the sole of my boot, touched it to the fuse, and threw the explosive in a high, soaring arc toward the heavily guarded main gate. "Get down!" I shoved Evelyn behind a stack of massive raw pine logs. Boom! The explosion was apocalyptic. The shockwave knocked me off my feet, the concussive force rattling the teeth in my skull. A massive fireball ripped into the twilight sky. The heavy timber gates, along with the guard tower and the men in it, disintegrated into a shower of flaming splinters and twisted iron. Screams filled the air. The distraction was absolute. The entire camp turned toward the blazing ruins of their front gate. "Now!" I grabbed Evelyn's hand, hauling her to her feet. We didn't run toward the front. We ran toward the rear of the compound where the river cut close to the tree line. My gelding was tied near the office, too far away and surrounded by confused, panicked gunmen. We had to go on foot. We sprinted through the mud, weaving between stacks of lumber and rusting machinery. Evelyn kept pace, her bare, bruised feet flying over the rough ground, driven by the desperate need to get back to her daughter. A guard stepped out from behind the cookhouse, a shotgun leveled right at us. Before I could bring my Colt up, a sharp crack rang out beside my ear. The guard grabbed his shoulder, dropping the shotgun, and fell back. I looked at Evelyn. The little silver derringer was smoking in her hand. She didn't even blink. "Remind me never to play poker with you," I grunted, grabbing her hand again and pulling her toward the fence line. We reached the rear palisade. The timber wall was 10 feet high. I shoved my revolvers into their holsters and cupped my hands. "Step up! I'll heave you over!" Evelyn didn't hesitate. She placed her bare foot into my hands, and with a massive heave of my shoulders, I launched her upward. She caught the top of the palisade, scrambling over the rough wood with frantic agility, and dropped out of sight on the other side. I took 3 steps back, gathered my speed, and leaped. My hands caught the top edge of the timber. Just as I pulled my weight up, a rifle cracked from the yard behind me. It felt like someone swung a red-hot sledgehammer into my left side. The breath blasted out of my lungs in a bloody wheeze. The bullet ripped through the meat of my ribs, tearing through muscle and grazing the bone. My grip slipped. Searing, blinding agony flared through my torso. I hung there for a fraction of a second, the mud of the yard below calling me back. No. I made a promise. With a guttural roar, I channeled every ounce of willpower I possessed, ignoring the blood pouring down my side, and vaulted over the wall. I hit the ground on the other side hard, rolling through the wet ferns and dead leaves of the forest floor to absorb the impact. Evelyn was there instantly. She fell to her knees beside me, her hands grabbing my shoulders. In the dim moonlight filtering through the pines, her face was stark white with terror. "Vance! Oh my God, you're hit!" Her hands scrambled over my slicker, finding the warm, slick blood soaking through my shirt on the left side. "I'm all right," I lied through gritted teeth, forcing myself up onto one knee. The pain was nauseating, but the adrenaline was keeping me conscious. "Just a graze. We have to keep moving. They'll be over that wall in 2 minutes." I grabbed her hand. We plunged into the deep, black timber. We didn't stop running for an hour. We navigated by the pale moonlight, pushing through thick underbrush, crossing freezing streams to mask our scent, and climbing steep, rocky inclines. Behind us, the orange glow of the burning camp painted the sky, a beacon of the chaos we had left in our wake. Eventually, my body started to fail. The adrenaline burned off, leaving nothing but cold exhaustion and a throbbing, relentless agony in my side. I stumbled, my knees buckling. Evelyn caught me. Despite her own starvation and weakness, she threw her arm under my shoulder, taking my weight. "I've got you," she gasped, her voice fiercely determined. "You carried my daughter. Now I'm carrying you." We found a shallow cave beneath the roots of an ancient overturned oak tree. It was dry, hidden from the wind, and completely invisible from the trail. We collapsed into the dirt. I leaned against the earth wall, my breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. I pressed my hand against my side, trying to stem the bleeding. Evelyn knelt in front of me. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed the hem of her ruined blue dress and ripped a long strip of fabric free. "Let me see it," she demanded. I moved my hand. She carefully unbuttoned my blood-soaked shirt, exposing the jagged, bleeding tear along my ribs. Her cool fingers grazed my skin, and despite the pain, a shiver ran through me that had nothing to do with the cold. "The bullet passed through," she whispered, her voice shaking slightly now that the immediate danger had passed. "You're losing a lot of blood, Vance." She folded the fabric into a thick pad and pressed it hard against the wound. I groaned, my head falling back against the dirt wall. She leaned in close, her face inches from mine, holding the pressure on my side. In the absolute dark of the forest, with the distant shouts of Thorn's hunting parties echoing through the trees, we were completely alone. I looked at her, really looked at her. The dirt smudged on her cheeks, the fierce intelligence in her green eyes, the incredible, unbroken strength of her spirit. "Why did you do it?" she whispered, her gaze dropping to my lips, then back to my eyes. "Why did you come for me? You could have just taken Lily to the sheriff. You didn't have to walk into that camp." I reached up with a heavy, blood-stained hand and gently tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear. "Because a woman who walks into a wolf's den to save her little bird," I rasped, the truth finally breaking through the iron walls I had built around my heart, "is a woman worth burning the whole damn forest down for." Evelyn's breath hitched. She didn't pull away from my touch. Instead, she leaned into my palm, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. We sat there in the dark, the blood and the dirt and the danger pressing in around us. And for the first time in my life, I knew exactly what I was fighting for. We didn't stay in the cave. Thorn's men had dogs, and a shallow hole in the dirt wouldn't hide the scent of my blood for long. We climbed higher into the timberline, where the rain turned to a biting, freezing sleet, and eventually into a heavy, silent snow. Every step was a negotiation with gravity and agony. The bullet had torn a nasty gouge across my ribs, and with every breath, it felt like someone was dragging a rusty saw blade through my chest. But Evelyn's arm was an iron band around my waist, her shoulder bearing my weight, her sheer, stubborn will pulling us both up the mountain. "Almost there," I ground out, my teeth chattering as the freezing wind whipped around us. "Grit knows. The old trapper line." "Stop talking, Vance. Save your breath," she ordered, her voice trembling with cold but anchored in resolve. An hour before dawn, a small, dark shape emerged from the swirling whiteout. It was an old line cabin, built from unpeeled pine logs, tucked beneath a massive granite overhang that shielded it from the worst of the weather. No smoke rose from the chimney. Grit was too smart for that. But I could see the faint yellow glow of a shielded lantern leaking through the cracks in the heavy wooden shutters. I stumbled against the heavy oak door, my bloody hand leaving a smear on the frost-covered wood, and knocked 3 times. 2 heavy, 1 light. The old martial code. For a terrifying second, there was silence. Then the heavy iron crossbar scraped back. The door yanked open, revealing the barrel of a 10-gauge scattergun, followed immediately by Grit's weathered, grim face. He took one look at my blood-soaked slicker and Evelyn's bruised, freezing form and lowered the gun. "Get inside, now!" He grabbed me by the collar of my coat, hauling me over the threshold as Evelyn followed, slamming and barring the door behind us. The cabin was freezing, but it was dry, and the absolute absence of the howling wind felt like a miracle. "Mama!" The scream tore through the small, dim room. From a pile of furs in the corner, a tiny figure launched itself across the floorboards. Evelyn dropped to her knees, not caring about the hard wood or her bruised skin, and caught Lily in her arms. The force of the child's embrace nearly knocked them both over. I leaned heavily against the log wall, sliding down until I hit the floor, pressing my hand against my bleeding side. But I didn't close my eyes. I watched them. Evelyn buried her face in Lily's dark hair, sobbing, deep, wrenching, violent sobs that held the weight of 4 days of absolute terror, starvation, and the certainty of death. Lily clung to her mother's neck like she was trying to fuse their bodies together, crying out wordless sounds of pure relief. Evelyn kissed her face, her forehead, her cheeks, running trembling hands over her daughter's arms and legs, proving to herself that the child was real, whole, and safe. "I told you," Lily hiccuped, her huge eyes looking over her mother's shoulder at me. "I told you the giant man would bring you back." Evelyn pulled back slightly, wiping her tears with the back of her bruised, filthy hand. She looked at me, sitting in a pool of my own blood against the wall. The gratitude in her green eyes was so raw, so blindingly bright, it hurt more than the bullet wound. Yeah, little bird, I rasped, forcing a grim smile. The giant man keeps his word. Then the edges of my vision started to turn black. The room tilted. Vance! Evelyn's voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. Grit was suddenly there, hauling me up by my armpits. Help me get him to the table, Mrs. Hayes. He's bled through everything he's wearing. They dragged me to the heavy slab of timber that served as a dining table in the center of the room. Grit laid me flat. The pain was blinding, a brilliant, flashing white light behind my eyelids. I need boiling water, Grit, Evelyn's voice cut through the haze. Gone was the weeping mother. In her place was a woman who had survived the frontier. Get the fire going. He said you couldn't have smoke, but if we don't stitch this and clean it, he'll die of infection before Thorne's men ever find us. Keep the draft low. Yes, ma'am, Grit said, moving with an obedience I had rarely seen the old tracker show anyone. I felt Evelyn's hands working the buttons of my shirt, tearing the fabric back to expose my chest. The cold air hit my sweating skin. I cracked my eyes open. She was standing over me, her face pale, a lantern casting dramatic shadows across her sharp cheekbones. It's a clean through and through, she muttered, inspecting the torn flesh over my ribs. But it tore a vein. I have to cauterize it and sew it shut. She looked at my face. Vance, do you hear me? This is going to hurt like hell. Do it, I grunted. Grit handed her a bottle of cheap raw whiskey and a sewing needle threaded with catgut, then went to heat a hunting knife in the coals of the newly lit fire. Evelyn uncorked the whiskey. Drink, she ordered, lifting my head and pressing the glass rim to my lips. I took 3 massive swallows, the alcohol burning a trail of fire down my throat. Then, she poured the rest directly into the open wound. I roared, my back arching off the table, my teeth grinding together so hard I thought my jaw would snap. My hands curled into fists, pounding the wood beneath me. Hold him down, Grit, she yelled. Grit threw his heavy weight over my legs. Evelyn took the glowing hot blade from him and pressed the flat of the steel directly against the severed vein in my side. The smell of my own burning flesh filled the cabin. The pain was absolute, eclipsing the world, driving me into a dark, roaring tunnel. I didn't pass out, though my brain begged for it. I focused on the only thing anchoring me to the earth. Evelyn's eyes locked onto mine, fierce and commanding. Stay with me, Vance, she commanded, tossing the knife aside and picking up the needle. Don't you dare close your eyes. She began to stitch. Her hands were remarkably steady despite being covered in my blood and her own bruises. Every pull of the thick thread was a fresh agony, but there was a strange, intimate rhythm to it. Her fingers brushed against my skin, cool and firm. I felt the phantom brush of her breath against my collarbone. For 30 minutes, it was just the sound of the wind outside, the crackle of the low fire, and the steady, determined movement of her hands fixing what the world had broken. When she finally bit the end of the thread and tied it off, she collapsed into a wooden chair beside the table, her hands shaking uncontrollably now that the job was done. You're a tough bastard, Sterling, Grit muttered, tossing a clean woolen blanket over my chest. I'll take first watch. I set up some tripwires in the timber. I'll be by the window. He retreated to the far corner of the cabin, settling into the shadows with his Winchester, pulling his hat low. Over on the furs, Lily had succumbed to exhaustion again, her chest rising and falling in a deep, peaceful sleep, secure in the knowledge that her mother was a few feet away. I lay on the table for a long time, letting the whiskey and the heat of the fire dull the screaming in my nerves. Slowly, I pushed myself up into a sitting position, wrapping the blanket around my bare shoulders. Evelyn was sitting by the hearth, staring into the flames. The orange light danced across her face, highlighting the dirt, the dark circles under her eyes, and the undeniable, breathtaking beauty of her spirit. I swung my legs off the table and walked slowly, painfully over to the hearth. I lowered myself onto the floorboards beside her chair, extending my long legs toward the fire. She looked down at me. You shouldn't be moving. If I stop moving, I get stiff. When I get stiff, I get slow. I can't afford to be slow right now, Evelyn. She sighed, a sound of profound exhaustion, and slid down from the chair to sit on the floor beside me. Our shoulders brushed. The heat radiating between us was palpable, fighting back the chill of the cabin. "I don't understand you, Vance Sterling," she said quietly, staring into the embers. "Pike called you a hermit, a rancher who hates the world. But you fight like a trained killer. You move through that cellar like a man who has lived his whole life with a gun in his hand. Who are you really?" I stared at the fire, watching the wood turn to ash. I had kept my secrets locked away in a Nevada vault and a hardened heart for years. But sitting here, bleeding and battered, beside the woman who had just sewn me back together, the armor felt heavy, pointless. "I was a U.S. Marshal for 15 years, I said, my voice low, a gravelly rumble in the quiet cabin. I rode the territories. I hunted men who did things to innocent people that would make the devil sick. I spent my life wading through blood." Evelyn turned her head, her green eyes wide, drinking in the truth. "I got tired, Evelyn. I got so damn tired of the killing," I continued, tracing a scar on my forearm. "Then my estranged father died. He was a ruthless capitalist. He left me a silver mine in Nevada, a vein so rich it produces millions. Overnight, I went from a marshal making $40 a month to one of the wealthiest men in the country." She gasped softly. "A millionaire?" "Yeah, and I hated every cent of it. I saw what money did to men like my father, to men like Silas Thorne. It turns them into monsters. It makes them think they can buy human lives. So I hid it. I took a fraction of it, bought the biggest, most isolated piece of land I could find, and built a fortress to keep the world out. I wanted to be left alone with my cattle and my ghosts." I turned my head to look at her. Then I kicked open a door in a rainstorm and found a starving little girl holding a bag of dynamite. Evelyn let out a breath that was half laugh, half sob. "And dragged yourself back into the war." "Not just the war," I whispered, reaching out. I gently traced the line of her bruised jaw, my thumb brushing against her lower lip. She trembled, her eyes fluttering shut at the contact. I dragged myself back into the land of the living. She opened her eyes, and the fire I saw in them wasn't hatred anymore. It was a deep, consuming heat. "You're a good man, Vance," she whispered fiercely. "Scars and all. I'm a violent man, Evelyn. You're the man who saved my daughter, and you came back for me." She didn't wait for me to close the distance. She leaned in, her hands coming up to grip the lapels of my coat, and pressed her lips to mine. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was desperate, wild, and forged in the crucible of survival. She tasted of salt and whiskey and raw, unfiltered life. My arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her flush against my uninjured side, groaning into her mouth as the fire in my veins flared hotter than the hearth. She kissed me like she was trying to brand her soul onto mine, her fingers tangling in my hair, holding me like I was the only solid ground left in the universe. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless, resting our foreheads together in the dim light. "I'm going to kill him, Evelyn," I vowed, my voice a dark, lethal promise. "I am going to end Silas Thorne, and then I am going to build you and Lily a life so safe you'll forget what the dark even looks like." She gripped my hand, intertwining her fingers with mine. "We'll end him, together." The dawn brought a fragile, deceptive peace to the mountain. The snow had stopped, leaving the timber buried under 2 feet of pristine, blinding white powder. But peace was an illusion we couldn't afford. "They'll track us," Grit said, peering through a crack in the shutters as he sipped bitter chicory coffee. "The snow covers the blood, but Thorne's got Indian trackers on payroll. They can follow the depression in the drifts. We can't hold up in this box. We've got no ammo reserves and only one way out." I was sitting at the table, strapping on my gun belt. My side burned like a lit coal furnace, but the stitches held and the stiffness was manageable. I checked the cylinder of my Colts. We go back to the ranch. It's built for a siege. The walls are field stone, the doors are reinforced ironwood, and Cookie has enough ammunition stockpiled in the cellar to fight the Civil War over again. Evelyn was helping Lily bundle into a heavy fur coat we'd found in the cabin provisions. She looked up, her expression grim. "Thorne will bring his whole army to your front door, Vance. He knows I have the schematics, and he knows I can identify him as John's murderer. He has to kill us all." "Let him come," I said, racking the lever of my Winchester. "I want him in the open." The ride down the mountain was agonizingly slow. We put Lily in front of Grit on his horse while Evelyn rode double with me, her arms wrapped tight around my waist, avoiding my left side. The cold was brutal, but the proximity to her gave me a fierce, burning focus. We reached the Sterling Ranch by midday. The sprawling, fortress-like structure stood defiant against the gray winter sky. My ranch hands, 15 hardened cowboys who had been with me for years, were already heavily armed and patrolling the perimeter. Cookie ran out to meet us as we rode into the courtyard. "Boss, thank the Lord. We saw the smoke from the timber camp last night. Figured you started a war." "I did, Cookie," I said, sliding off my gelding and helping Evelyn down. "And Thorne is bringing it here. Board up the lower windows. Haul the water troughs inside. Nobody leaves the main house or the stone barn. Distribute the repeating rifles and the buckshot." For the next 4 hours, the ranch transformed into a hardened military bunker. The sound of hammers driving nails into heavy wooden planks echoed through the valley. Horses were brought into the inner courtyard. Rifles were propped at every firing slit. I took Evelyn and Lily down to the root cellar beneath the kitchen. It was essentially a vault, carved out of the bedrock, lined with shelves of canned goods and ammunition crates. The heavy iron door could stop a cannonball. "You stay down here," I told Evelyn, lighting a lantern and hanging it on a hook. I looked at Lily, who was sitting bravely on a sack of flour, clutching her leather satchel. "You keep your mama safe, little bird. Don't open this door until you hear my voice." Evelyn grabbed my arm before I could turn away. "Vance." She wasn't crying. She was terrified, but her jaw was set. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the silver derringer she had taken from Thorne. She checked the double barrels, snapped it shut, and looked me dead in the eye. "I'm not hiding in the dark waiting to die," she said firmly. "I'll stay with Lily. But if that iron door opens and it's not you, the first man through it gets lead between his eyes." I looked at the woman I had fallen in love with in less than 48 hours. "I pity the bastard who tries," I whispered. I kissed her, hard, fast, and desperate, and then I slammed the heavy iron door shut, throwing the massive steel bolt into place. I walked back upstairs into the main hall. The sun was dipping below the ridge, casting long, bloody shadows across the snow. The house was dead quiet. Men stood by the boarded windows, peering through the slits, the smell of gun oil and nervous sweat heavy in the air. Grit stood by the massive front door, peering through a small viewing port. "Here they come," Grit said, his voice flat. I walked to the window beside him and looked out over the sprawling, snow-covered valley. At the edge of the tree line, about 400 yards out, torches began to flare. 1, then 10, then 30. A massive line of riders emerged from the timber. 50 men, heavily armed, riding massive dark horses. In the center of the line, riding a pristine white stallion, was Silas Thorne. Even from this distance, I could feel the sheer, arrogant fury radiating off him. He had lost his camp, he had lost his leverage, and he had been humiliated by a lone rancher. He wasn't here to negotiate. He was here to erase us from the map. "Hold your fire," I ordered my men, my voice booming through the hall. "Let them get within 100 yards. Make every bullet count." Thorne's men spread out, forming a massive semicircle, effectively cutting off any avenue of escape. They began to advance at a slow, deliberate trot, their horses' hooves muffled by the deep snow. 200 yards, 150 yards. "Steady," I whispered, resting the barrel of my Winchester on the window ledge, drawing a bead on a rider carrying a lit torch. 100 yards. "Now, give 'em hell!" I roared. The Sterling Ranch erupted in a continuous, deafening roar of gunfire. 15 repeating rifles fired in unison. The front line of Thorne's mercenaries disintegrated. Men were blown out of their saddles. Horses screamed and reared, crashing into one another. The pristine white snow was instantly stained with bright blooming patches of crimson. "Keep pouring it on," Grit yelled, working the lever of his rifle so fast it was a blur, brass casings raining down on the floorboards around his boots. But Thorne had 50 men, and they were seasoned killers. They recovered from the initial shock quickly. They spurred their horses forward, charging the house at a full gallop, firing wildly at our gun slits. Bullets began to tear into the ranch. The sound was terrifying. The sharp thwack of lead bearing itself into solid oak, the shattering of glass behind the wooden boards, the high-pitched whine of ricochets spinning off the stone chimney. Plaster rained down from the ceiling. A bullet punched through the wall inches from my head, showering my face in wood splinters. I didn't blink. I sighted down the barrel, fired, and watched a mercenary fall backward off his galloping horse. I levered, fired again, dropping another. My shoulder went numb from the relentless recoil. "They're flanking us!" Cookie screamed from the back kitchen window. "They're going for the barn!" I sprinted toward the back of the house. Through the window, I saw 10 of Thorne's men dismounting by the massive fieldstone barn where we kept the winter hay. They weren't trying to shoot their way in. They were hurling lit torches through the hayloft doors. Within seconds, the dry hay caught. A massive pillar of orange flame shot into the night sky, illuminating the courtyard in a hellish, flickering light. The horses inside began to scream, a terrible, high-pitched sound of pure animal terror. "No!" I yelled. "Vance, the wind is blowing this way," Grit shouted over the din of battle. "If that barn goes up fully, the embers will catch the main house roof. They're trying to smoke us out. Cover me!" I kicked the back door open, a Colt peacemaker in each hand. I stepped out onto the back porch into a hail of gunfire. Bullets sparked off the stone walls around me like angry fireflies. I ignored them. I walked straight down the porch stairs, firing continuously, a relentless machine of death. Every time I squeezed the triggers, a man near the burning barn dropped. I moved with a cold, terrifying precision, the marshal of old resurrected in the flames. I reached the heavy barn doors, shot the padlock off, and hauled them open. The heat blasted me in the face, singeing my eyebrows. "Yah! Get out! Go!" I screamed, slapping the flanks of the panicked horses, driving them out into the snowy night, away from the flames. As the last horse bolted past me, a bullet slammed into my left shoulder, just inches above my newly stitched ribs. The impact spun me around, dropping me to my knees in the snow. I dropped the left Colt, my arm going completely dead. Through the roaring flames and the thick black smoke, a massive figure stepped out. It was a man the size of a grizzly bear, wielding a double-barreled shotgun. He racked the hammers, aiming it down at my chest. Before he could pull the trigger, his head snapped violently to the side, a red mist exploding in the firelight. He collapsed in a heap. I looked back at the house. Standing in the kitchen window, her hair wild, the heavy Sharps buffalo rifle I kept above the mantel pressed against her shoulder, was Evelyn Hayes. She had disobeyed my order to stay in the cellar. She had come up to the war. She worked the lever, ejecting the massive brass shell, and met my eyes through the smoke. "I told you we'd fight him together," her look said. I grabbed my dropped Colt with my right hand, hauled myself to my feet, and sprinted back to the house as the roof of the barn finally collapsed in a shower of sparks. I fell through the back door, gasping for air, clutching my bleeding shoulder. Evelyn dropped the rifle and ran to me, her hands flying over me, terrified. "I'm fine," I lied, though I was rapidly bleeding out from 2 separate wounds. Grit ran into the kitchen, his face covered in soot and sweat. "We've got a problem, Vance. 2 of our boys are dead, 4 more are wounded, and we're out of Winchester ammo for the front line. Thorne's pulling his men back behind the tree line. They're preparing for a massive coordinated charge to breach the front door." I looked around the smoke-filled kitchen. My men were bleeding, exhausted, and outgunned. Thorne had the numbers, the ammunition, and the cover of the timber. We were trapped in a burning box. "We fall back to the inner hallway," I ordered, my voice raspy. "Blockade the corridor. We make them fight for every inch of floorboard. Grit grabbed my good arm, his grip surprisingly tight. He looked at me, his gray eyes unreadable, calculating. "Vance," Grit said quietly. "If they breach the hall, they breach the cellar. They get the girl, they get Evelyn. They have to go through me first," I growled. "That's exactly what I'm counting on," Grit whispered. Before I could process the strange tone in his voice, before my exhausted, blood-drained mind could register the threat, Grit moved. He drew his revolver with blinding speed and slammed the heavy steel butt directly into the back of my skull. The world exploded into a shower of white stars. I hit the floor hard, paralyzed, the darkness rushing up to swallow me. The last thing I heard before I lost consciousness was Evelyn screaming my name, and the sound of Grit Henderson, my oldest friend, unlocking the heavy front door to let the wolves in. Consciousness returned not as a slow awakening, but as a violent, suffocating wave of agony. My skull throbbed with a blinding intensity, echoing the rhythmic, jarring thud of a horse at a heavy trot. My hands were bound brutally tight behind my back with coarse hemp rope, the fibers biting into my wrists with every jostle. I was slung face down over the saddle of a strange horse, the freezing night air whipping at my blood-soaked clothes. I coughed, tasting copper and ash. I tried to shift my weight, but the movement sent a searing spike of fire through my grazed ribs and the bullet hole in my shoulder. I groaned, the sound muffled by the heavy wool sack that had been tied over my head. "He's awake," a gruff voice called out from the darkness beside me. "Keep him quiet," another voice replied, smooth, arrogant, and dripping with satisfaction. Silas Thorne. "I want him fully lucid when we reach the camp. He needs to appreciate the architecture of the gallows we're going to build for him." I lay perfectly still over the saddle, letting the sway of the horse lull them into thinking I was on the brink of passing out again. My mind, however, was racing with cold, terrifying clarity. Grit, my oldest friend. The man who had guarded my back in a dozen firefights across the untamed territories. He had hit me. He had opened the door to Thorne's army. A lesser man would have been consumed by a blinding, irrational rage. I felt the sting of betrayal, certainly. But beneath the pain, the cold logic of a veteran marshal began to churn. Grit Henderson did not sell out. He didn't care about Thorne's gold. He had lived his whole life rejecting wealth. Why hit me? Why open the door? Because we had been out of ammunition. Because my men were dying. Because Thorne was preparing a final charge that would have breached the cellar, slaughtered my ranch hands, and put Evelyn and Lily back into the hands of a monster. Grit had traded the only piece on the board valuable enough to buy their survival. Me. In the old days, working deep undercover against the cattle-rustling syndicates in Wyoming, Grit and I had a standing protocol when we were boxed in with no exits. We called it the Trojan Horse. One of us surrendered, drawing the enemy's entire focus and leadership to a single point, getting inside their stronghold, while the other faded into the shadows to prepare the fatal blow. Grit hadn't sold me out, me. He had delivered me right to the center of Thorne's remaining forces. He had bought Evelyn and Lily time to slip away in the chaos of my capture. I was the bait. And if I had to die on a rope to ensure that little girl and her mother saw the sunrise, it was a price I was more than willing to pay. The ride lasted for hours. The temperature plummeted, the snow crunching heavily under the horses' hooves. Finally, the horses slowed. I heard the grinding of heavy timber and the murmur of dozens of voices. We had reached Thorne's secondary logging camp, a heavily fortified staging ground deep in the northern canyon, miles away from my ranch. Rough hands grabbed my coat, hauling me off the saddle. I hit the frozen ground hard, my injured shoulder taking the brunt of the impact. The agony tore a harsh grunt from my throat, but I bit down on my tongue, refusing to give them a scream. Someone yanked the hood off my head. The harsh glare of a dozen kerosene lanterns blinded me for a moment. When my vision cleared, I was on my knees in the center of a bustling lumber yard, surrounded by 30 armed mercenaries. The snow around me was trampled and muddy. Silas Thorne stood 10 feet away, flanked by heavily armed guards. He had changed out of his ruined suit and was wearing a heavy buffalo hide coat. He looked down at me, a sadistic smile twisting his handsome features. "Vance Sterling," Thorne said softly, stepping closer. "The hermit millionaire. The great protector of the weak." He clicked his tongue in mock sympathy. "Look at you now, dragged through the snow like a slaughtered calf by your own man. That must sting." I spat a mouthful of blood onto the snow at his polished boots. He knew a lost cause when he saw one. "What did you promise him, Thorne? A pocket full of silver and a head start?" Thorne laughed. "He asked for the woman and the brat and safe passage out of the valley. A remarkably cheap price for the man who burned my main camp to the ground." Thorne leaned in, his eyes narrowing to cold, hateful slits. "I let him ride off with them. Let him think he won. But my Indian trackers are already following his trail. They'll be dead before dawn, Sterling, but you won't be that lucky." He nodded to a massive brute standing to my right. A heavy steel-toed boot crashed into my ribs, directly over the bullet graze. The world fractured into jagged shards of white-hot pain. I collapsed onto my side, gasping for air that refused to enter my lungs. "Pick him up," Thorne ordered casually. Two men hauled me back to my knees. The brute stepped forward again, driving his fist into my stomach, then my jaw. My head snapped back. Blood poured from my nose and mouth, warm and thick. They beat me with a methodical, terrifying efficiency. They didn't want to kill me yet. They wanted to break me. They wanted the U.S. Marshal to beg. Every blow was a testament to the empire I had humiliated. I took the hits. I let the darkness creep into the edges of my vision. I didn't beg. I didn't utter a single word of surrender. Instead, I thought of Evelyn. I thought of the fierce, unyielding green of her eyes as she sewed my flesh together. I thought of Lily's small, fragile hand wrapping around my thumb in the dark. I let their faces anchor me to the earth, while Thorne's men tried to beat me out of it. After what felt like an eternity, Thorne raised a hand. The beating stopped. I slumped forward, hanging by the grip the guards had on my arms, my breath rattling in my broken chest. "Enough," Thorne said, looking at a pocket watch. "Dawn is breaking. The boys need some entertainment to lift their spirits." He gestured toward a massive, towering oak tree at the edge of the lumberyard. A thick, fresh hemp rope hung from a sturdy branch, the noose swaying gently in the freezing wind. "String him up," Thorne commanded. "Let's see if the great Vance Sterling dances in the air." And they dragged me through the mud and snow toward the tree. My legs refused to support my weight. Every inch of my body was a symphony of agony. As they hauled me upright beneath the branch and slipped the rough, scratching fibers of the noose around my bruised neck, I looked out at the dark timberline surrounding the camp. I did my part, Grit, I thought, the darkness finally pulling me under. Now, do yours. The sky was bleeding into a pale, bruised violet as the sun threatened to rise. I stood on a wobbly wooden crate beneath the sprawling oak, the coarse rope biting into the raw skin of my neck. My hands were still bound tightly behind me. The cold was absolute, seeping into the marrow of my bones, but the adrenaline surging through my veins burned like a furnace. Thorne stood a few yards away, savoring the moment. His entire surviving mercenary army, some 40 men, had gathered in a semicircle to watch the execution. They were laughing, passing around a bottle of cheap whiskey, completely focused on the bloody spectacle before them. "Any final words, Sterling?" Thorne asked, his voice carrying over the wind. "A confession, perhaps? A plea for your soul?" I looked down at him through my swollen, blackened eyes. I drew a deep, ragged breath, tasting the metallic tang of my own blood. "Yeah," I rasped, my voice barely more than a gravelly whisper. "I've got a few." Thorne smiled, stepping closer to hear my final defeat. Before I could open my mouth, a sound like the wrath of God tore through the freezing morning air. Boom! The explosion didn't just rock the camp. It shattered the earth. A massive fireball erupted from the heavy timber armory on the western edge of the yard. A shockwave slammed into us, a physical wall of force that knocked Thorne flat on his back and sent half the mercenaries tumbling into the snow. Shrapnel, flaming wood, and twisted iron rained down from the sky. Panic erupted. The horses tethered near the armory screamed, tearing free of their posts and stampeding through the camp. Through the billowing black smoke and the falling debris, a lone figure emerged on the catwalk of the nearest watchtower. It wasn't Grit Henderson. It was Evelyn Hayes, her dark hair whipped wildly in the wind. She was holding my heavy Sharps buffalo rifle, her face a mask of absolute terrifying vengeance. She didn't hesitate. She leveled the massive rifle and pulled the trigger. The thunderous boom of the .50 caliber weapon dropped the mercenary closest to the mechanism holding my rope. "Kill her!" Thorne screamed, scrambling to his feet, drawing his revolver. But the camp was in utter pandemonium. Before his men could aim, a second explosion ripped through the supply wagons. Grit was out there in the timber using the rest of the dynamite from Lily's satchel to systematically dismantle Thorne's fortress. The guard holding the rope to my noose had dropped it in the chaos. I didn't wait for an invitation. With a violent twist of my shoulders, ignoring the tearing agony in my chest, I dropped into a squat, shifting my bound hands down past my hips, stepping over my own arms until my hands were in front of me. I grabbed the noose, yanking it over my head just as a bullet sparked off the tree trunk inches from my ear. I dove off the crate, rolling into the snow. I snatched a fallen revolver from a dead mercenary's grip, my bound hands making it clumsy. But I had spent my life mastering the geometry of a gunfight. I came up on one knee, firing twice. Two of Thorne's men charging the watchtower went down. "Sterling!" Thorne roared. He was charging me, his handsome face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. He fired wildly, a bullet grazing my thigh. I fired back, but the cylinder clicked empty. I threw the useless gun at his face and lunged. We collided like two runaway trains in the bloody snow. I was bigger, but I was bleeding out, starved of oxygen and battered to the brink of death. Thorne was fresh and fueled by desperate rage. We grappled, rolling through the freezing mud, gouging, punching, fighting like wild animals. He pinned me, his hands finding my throat, squeezing with terrifying strength. I gagged, my vision swimming with black spots. I brought my bound hands up, driving my thumbs into his eyes. He shrieked, rearing back. I bucked him off, scrambling to my feet. Thorne pulled a long, jagged hunting knife from his belt. He lunged, slashing upward. I twisted, but not fast enough. The blade sank deep into my abdomen, just below my ribs. A cold, paralyzing shock radiated outward from the wound. I gasped, stumbling backward, hitting the trunk of the oak tree. I slid down, my blood pouring out, turning the snow beneath me a brilliant, sickening crimson. Thorne stood over me, panting heavily, his face covered in mud and blood. He looked down at the knife in his hand, then at me. A triumphant, vicious smile broke across his face. The gunfire around the camp was dying down. Evelyn and Grit had done their damage, but Thorne had me. "Look at you," Thorne spat, kicking my leg. "The millionaire savior, dying in the mud. I'm going to take this valley, Sterling. I'm going to find that woman and her brat, and I'm going to make them wish they had burned in that cabin. You lost." He raised his revolver, pointing it directly at the space between my eyes, ready to deliver the execution he had promised. I looked up at him. The pain was fading, replaced by a strange floating cold. But my mind was sharper than it had ever been. "I didn't lose," I whispered, coughing up a spatter of blood. Thorne frowned, his finger tightening on the trigger. "What did you say?" I leaned my head back against the bark, looking him dead in his shark eyes. And then I delivered the last words he would ever hear, words that carried the weight of millions of dollars and a lifetime of strategy. "I didn't take your land, Thorne," I rasped, a bloody smile touching my lips. "I took your money." Thorne froze. "What?" "The bank in San Francisco," I wheezed, fighting to stay conscious. "The Eastern financiers backing your railroad. While you were out here chasing a widow and a little girl, I sent a telegram. Using the Nevada silver, I bought it all. I bought every outstanding loan, every promissory note, every debt tied to your name." The color drained from Silas Thorne's face. The gun in his hand wavered. "You don't own this timber," I whispered, the final nail in his coffin. "You don't own the railroad. You don't own the canyon pass. You are my debtor, Silas. And as of midnight last night, I foreclosed on everything. You're a beggar." He stared at me, the magnitude of his absolute ruin crashing down on him. The empire he had killed for, the monopoly he had bled the territory dry to build, had been bought out from under him by the very man bleeding out at his feet. The sheer psychological shock paralyzed him. It was all the opening I needed. From the cuff of my right boot, obscured by the snow and my bound hands, I slipped the tiny double-barreled derringer that Evelyn had returned to me before the siege. I brought my bound hands up in a flash of movement. Crack! The tiny gun roared. The bullet caught Silas Thorne square in the center of his chest. He staggered backward, his eyes wide with disbelief, the revolver falling from his hand. He looked down at the blood blossoming over his heart, looked back at me, and then collapsed backward into the snow, dead before his head hit the ground. I let the derringer slip from my fingers. The dark edges of my vision finally collapsed inward. The last thing I saw was Evelyn, dropping her rifle and running through the smoke and the bodies, screaming my name, her green eyes the last light in a fading world. The world returned not with pain, but with light. It was a soft, golden light, filtering through pristine lace curtains. I lay still for a long time, listening. The wind wasn't howling. The gunfire was gone. Instead, I heard the gentle, rhythmic chirp of a meadowlark outside a window and the soft, steady sound of someone breathing nearby. I tried to move my hand. It felt heavy, wrapped in thick cotton bandages, but the pain was a dull, manageable ache rather than a blinding fire. I opened my eyes. I was in my own bedroom at the Sterling Ranch. The air smelled of clean linen, lavender, and faint wood smoke. Sitting in a rocking chair beside the bed, bathed in a pool of morning sunlight, was Evelyn. She was asleep. Her dark hair was washed and braided, falling softly over the shoulder of a simple, beautiful white cotton dress. The bruises had faded from her face, leaving behind the stunning, unbroken porcelain of her features. Her chest rose and fell in a deep, peaceful rhythm. She looked like an angel that had fought her way through hell and finally found her rest. I moved my head slightly, the rustle of the sheets breaking the silence. Instantly, Evelyn's eyes fluttered open. The brilliant green locked onto me, and for a second she just stared, as if afraid I was a ghost. Then, a sob broke from her lips. She dropped to her knees beside the bed, carefully avoiding my heavily bandaged chest, and buried her face in my neck. Her hands, soft and warm, framed my scarred face. "You're awake," she breathed, her tears hot against my skin. "The doctor said, he said if you didn't wake up today—" "Takes more than a knife and a blizzard to kill a grumpy old marshal," I rasped. My throat was dry as dust, but the sound of my own voice felt like a victory. Evelyn let out a watery laugh, kissing my cheek, my forehead, my jaw. "You've been unconscious for 2 weeks, Vance. 2 weeks. Thorne?" I asked, my instincts still wired for war. "Dead," she whispered, her thumb brushing gently over my cheekbone. His men surrendered when they saw him fall and realized Grit had the high ground with the dynamite. The territory marshal arrived 3 days later. They found the graves of the homesteaders Thorne murdered, including John's. It's over, Vance. The camp is dismantled. The valley is safe." "The foreclosure?" Evelyn smiled. A radiant, breathtaking thing. "The telegram went through perfectly. Your lawyers from Nevada arrived last week. You own the railroad company now. You own the timber rights. You own half the territory." I groaned, letting my head fall back against the pillows. Just what I wanted. More paperwork. "Mama? Is he awake?" The small voice came from the doorway. I turned my head. Lily stood there wearing a clean, bright yellow dress. Her face was fuller, the haunted starvation replaced by the rosy flush of a healthy, safe child. She was clutching her battered leather satchel, but she wasn't hiding behind it anymore. "Come here, little bird," I called out softly. She ran across the room, climbing carefully onto the edge of the mattress. She looked at the bandages wrapping my chest, her big dark eyes solemn. "Did it hurt?" she asked. "When you fought the bad man?" "A little," I admitted, "but it was worth it." She reached out and patted my good hand. "Grit says you're the toughest bastard in the West, but Cookie says I'm not supposed to say bastard." I let out a bark of laughter that quickly turned into a wince as my ribs protested. Evelyn smiled, pulling Lily into her lap. "Well, you tell Cookie that Grit is right," I said, smiling at the two of them. 3 months later, spring came to the valley not with a whisper but with a roar of green. The snowmelt swelled the rivers, and the ridge was carpeted in vibrant wildflowers. The Sterling Ranch had been rebuilt, the scars of the siege covered by fresh timber and new stone. I stood on the wide front porch, leaning slightly on a carved oak cane. My body was still healing. The doctors said I would carry a limp for the rest of my life, but I had never felt stronger. Down in the valley, the sounds of construction echoed over the wind. I wasn't building a railroad. I was using the Thorn buyout and the Nevada silver to build a new town, a hospital, a schoolhouse, and a proper sheriff's office. I had handed the timber rights over to a cooperative run by the local homesteaders. The millionaire hermit was dead. I had found something better to do with my fortune. The screen door creaked open behind me, two arms wrapped gently around my waist from behind. Evelyn rested her cheek against my back, right between my shoulder blades. She smelled of sunshine and fresh-baked bread. "Lily is down at the creek with Grit," Evelyn murmured, her hands resting over mine on the railing. "He's teaching her how to track rabbits. I told him if he teaches her how to chew tobacco, I'm taking his shotgun away." I chuckled, turning in her arms to face her. Evelyn looked up at me, her green eyes bright with a love so deep and profound it still occasionally stole my breath. She reached up, her fingers tracing the faded scars on my cheek. "You're a long way from the angry man who kicked open a cabin door in the rain," she whispered. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," I replied, pulling her flush against my chest. I bent my head, capturing her lips. The kiss was slow, deep, and intoxicating. There was no desperation in it anymore, no fear of the encroaching dark. It was a promise, a celebration of survival, a testament to the life we had forged in the fire. She sighed into my mouth, her hands moving up to tangle in my hair, pulling me closer. The heat between us, a slow burning ember since that night in the snowbound cabin, flared into a brilliant, consuming flame. I broke the kiss, resting my forehead against hers, my breathing ragged. "Mrs. Sterling," I murmured, the title still feeling like a miracle on my tongue since the quiet ceremony in town a month prior. "If you keep looking at me like that, I'm going to have to carry you upstairs." And my doctor explicitly forbade heavy lifting. Evelyn's lips curved into a wicked, beautiful smile. She took my hand, stepping back toward the door, her eyes never leaving mine. "Then it's a good thing I can walk up the stairs myself, Mr. Sterling," she purred, pulling me gently inside. "And I seem to recall you telling me that you never listen to doctors anyway." I followed my wife into the cool, quiet shadows of our home, the heavy oak door closing firmly behind us, shutting out the world. I had spent my life searching for peace in isolation and trying to ignore a fortune buried deep in the Nevada rocks. But as I pulled Evelyn into my arms, I finally understood the truth. The silver didn't matter. The land didn't matter. My true fortune was right here, in the fierce, beating heart of the woman who had saved me, and the family we had built from the ashes. Sometimes the strongest men are not the ones who fight the hardest, but the ones who choose to protect when they have every reason not to care. This story reminds us that even in the darkest storms, compassion can become the most powerful weapon. This channel brings you stories of the Wild West, cowboys, love, sacrifice, and the deep bonds between people. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more. All characters and situations in this book are fictional and developed for narrative purposes. The author does not intend to reflect or comment on any real individual or event. Readers should approach the story as a work of fiction, not as a factual account.